What would you do if you had access to all the wealth you could ever imagine? If gold flowed into your hands in such abundance that you stopped counting it? If you ruled over a kingdom so prosperous that leaders from distant lands traveled for weeks just to witness your success? Most people believe that reaching that level of abundance would finally bring peace, securities, and satisfaction. But the stories of the richest man in the Bible reveals a far more uncomfortable truth. Solomon possessed a level of wealth that defies any modern comparison. His treasures were legendary. His projects transformed an entire nation. His influence extended far beyond the borders of his kingdom. Yet, after living surrounded by everything millions of people spend their lives chasing, he arrived at a conclusion that still surprises those who discover it for the first time. Because humanity's greatest financial problem has never been a lack of money. It is a lack of wisdom. Solomon observed something that continues to happen today. People who work harder every year, yet live with greater anxiety. People who earn more money, yet never feel it is enough. People who accumulate possessions, properties, and resources, but still experience fear whenever they think about the future. And the more he studied the relationship between human beings and money, the more he realized does not solve the problems most people imagine. In fact, many times it amplifies them. That is why his financial teachings do not begin with gold, investments, or business. They begin with decisions, character, prudence, and self-control. Because for Solomon, true prosperity never started in the wallet. It started in the mind. Throughout his life, he left behind principles that have survived wars, economic crises, entire empires, and thousands of years of change. Principles so simple that many ignore them. So powerful that those who apply them completely transform their relationship with money. And perhaps the most surprising part is that his most valuable lessons did not emerge while he was building his fortune, but after he had already achieved it. In the next few minutes, you will discover why Solomon insisted that wisdom must come before wealth, what financial mistake he saw destroying lives again and again, and what the richest man in the Bible learned after experiencing everything money could offer. Because if anyone was qualified to speak about wealth, it was Solomon. And what he discovered could permanently change the way you see money. When people hear the name Solomon, they usually think of wisdom. But there is one detail that often goes unnoticed. His wisdom never remained an abstract idea. It became visible results. It turned into prosperity, stability, and a level of wealth so extraordinary that it became a benchmark for generations. The Bible describes the times when silver became so abundant in Jerusalem that it was no longer considered valuable. Imagine living in a society where the very thing most people spend their entire lives pursuing becomes ordinary. That was the level of prosperity reached during Solomon's reign. Yet his wealth did not appear overnight. It was not the result of luck. And it certainly was not the product of an obsessive pursuit of money. Solomon understood something that most people still fail to grasp today. Money is an outcome, it is not the cause. While many people focus on getting rich as quickly as possible, Solomon focused on building structures capable of producing prosperity for decades. He organized his kingdom. He strengthened alliances. He developed trade routes. He managed resources strategically. He created conditions that allowed wealth to flow consistently rather than depending on isolated events. That made all the difference. Most people focus exclusively on increasing income. Solomon focused on increasing capacity. Because when a person develops greater capacity, results eventually follow. As we examine his story, we find the same pattern repeated over and over again. He thought long-term while others focused on the short term. He built while others consumed. He organized while others improvised. That mindset explains why rulers from distant regions heard stories about his kingdom and wanted to see it with their own eyes. They were not impressed merely by the gold. They were impressed by the system that produced the gold. The famous visit of the Queen of Sheba reflects this perfectly. She did not travel an enormous distance simply to observe material wealth. She traveled to understand the source of such extraordinary prosperity. And when she arrived, she discovered that behind all that abundance was something far more valuable than the visible treasures. There was a different way of thinking, a different way of making decisions, a different way of managing resources. This is the first great financial principle Solomon teaches. Lasting wealth never begins with money. It begins with the wisdom that directs money. And that is where we find the true secret that transformed his life. Because before he received gold, fame, or power, Solomon received something he considered infinitely more important. Something that would permanently change the destiny of his kingdom and become the foundation of all his financial teachings. There is a moment in Solomon's life that explains virtually everything that came afterward. A moment that, had he made a different choice, would likely have changed the entire course of his reign. The Bible tells us that God appeared to him and offered something extraordinary. There were no limits, no list of options. He simply asked a question that very few people would be prepared to answer correctly. What do you want me to give you? Pause for a moment and think about that. Most people would ask for money. Others would ask for power. Some would ask for influence, success, property, or a life free from problems. But Solomon asked for something completely different. He asked for wisdom. He asked for understanding to govern well. He asked for discernment to make good decisions. And that response reveals a financial truth that remains just as powerful today as it was thousands of years ago. Most people believe that wealth produces good decisions. Solomon understood that good decisions produce wealth. It seems like a small distinction, but it changes everything. Because a person can receive money without receiving wisdom. And when that happens, the money usually disappears. History is full of examples. Lottery winners who end up bankrupt. Athletes who earn millions only to face debt years later. Business owners who build massive fortunes and lose them through impulsive decisions. The problem was never the amount of money. The problem was the quality of the decisions. That is why Solomon repeatedly wrote about the importance of knowledge and understanding. He had discovered that wealth becomes much easier to manage when a person first develops the ability to manage it. 6. In other words, money amplifies what already exists inside a person. If discipline is present, wealth tends to grow. If disorder is present, wealth tends to accelerate that disorder. If prudence is present, opportunities appear. If impulsiveness is present, problems follow. Solomon observed this pattern throughout his entire life. He saw people pursuing wealth as though it were the ultimate goal. Yet he also watched many of them become trapped by the very abundance they had desired. Because money has a characteristic that few people recognize. It does not correct weaknesses. It exposes them. That is why wisdom occupies such a central place in Solomon's teachings. To him, learning how to think correctly was more important than learning how to make more money. One wise decision could generate benefits for years. One foolish decision could destroy decades of effort. And here is where the story becomes even more interesting. After asking for wisdom, Solomon received wealth, not because he was desperately chasing it, but because wisdom began influencing every area of his life. His alliances became better. His plans became better. His administration became better. His decisions became better. And the results eventually reflected that difference. This principle still works today. Most people ask how they can earn more. Solomon would have asked a different question. How can I develop greater wisdom to manage what I already have? Because a person who learns to govern small things well is often the one prepared to receive greater things. And it was precisely by observing those who ignored this principle that Solomon identified one of the most destructive financial mistakes a person can make. A mistake so common that millions repeat it every single day without realizing the consequences they are planting into their future. If there is one warning that appears repeatedly throughout Solomon's writings, it is this. Most people destroy their future because they want results too quickly. At first, haste seems harmless. It disguises itself as ambition, as enthusiasm, as the desire to get ahead. But Solomon observed that behind many poor financial decisions lay the very same problem. The inability to wait. That is why he wrote that the plans of the diligent lead to abundance, while haste leads to poverty. Notice that he is not talking about intelligence, nor talent, not even opportunity. He is talking about patience, because for Solomon, lasting wealth was the result of hundreds of correct decisions accumulated over time. Most people, however, look for shortcuts. They want the results before the process. They want the harvest before the planting. They want the reward before developing the capacity required to sustain it. And that is where the problem begins. Solomon saw merchants ruin themselves by trying to grow too fast. He saw people spend more than they could afford in order to project a level of success they had not yet achieved. He saw men chasing immediate profits without evaluating future consequences. What is remarkable is that these same mistakes still happen today. The tools change, the circumstances change, but human nature remains the same. Many people make financial decisions driven by temporary emotions. They buy because they feel desire. They invest because they feel excitement. They spend because they feel confident. They take on debt because they believe the future will somehow solve the problems of the present. But Solomon understood something that very few people truly grasp. Emotions change, consequences remain. That is why he emphasized prudence so strongly. Prudence is not fear. It is not pessimism. It is not living in paralysis. Prudence means looking beyond the present moment. It means asking not only what benefit a decision may bring today, but also what cost it may create tomorrow. While most people saw opportunities, Solomon saw risks. While others saw quick profits, he analyzed sustainability. While others thought in weeks, he thought in years. That difference in perspective explains much of his success, because wealth is rarely lost through a single catastrophic mistake. More often, it disappears through small bad decisions repeated over a long period of time. An unnecessary expense here, a poor investment there, an impulsive purchase, an avoidable financial obligation, a promise that cannot realistically be fulfilled. Each decision seems insignificant on its own, but together they build a destiny. Solomon understood that prosperity depends on more than how much comes into your hands. It also depends on how much you are able to preserve, manage, and multiply. That is why he taught that wisdom protects just as much as it produces. It is not enough to generate resources. You must also avoid the traps that can destroy them. And among all the financial traps he observed throughout his life, there was one he considered especially dangerous. One capable of turning a free person into a dependent one. One that quietly stole opportunities, peace of mind, and the ability to make independent decisions. It was a trap just as common then as it is today, and that is why Solomon spoke about it with a clarity that remains uncomfortable even thousands of years later. Most people believe that wealth is built by working more hours. Solomon thought differently, not because he despised work. Quite the opposite. He knew that diligence was essential, but he also understood that there is an unavoidable limit when a person depends entirely on their own physical effort to generate income. Every person has the same 24 hours in a day. The most disciplined worker in the world still faces the same limit as everyone else. And it was precisely this reality that led Solomon to develop a much broader vision of wealth creation. While others depended solely on what they could personally produce, he built systems capable of generating results continuously. That difference changed everything. Solomon's wealth did not come from a single activity. It did not depend on one source. It was not concentrated in a single project. His kingdom was connected through trade routes, strategic alliances, international exchanges, and multiple economic activities operating simultaneously. Each one created value. Each one strengthened the others. Each one contributed to the overall growth of the kingdom. This principle appears subtly throughout his teachings. Solomon understood that relying on a single source of income makes a person vulnerable. When everything depends on one door, all it takes is for that door to close for a crisis to emerge. That is why he emphasized the importance of spreading risk and expanding opportunities. Not because he could predict the future, precisely because he knew no one can. Uncertainty was not something he tried to eliminate. It was something he prepared for. And that mindset allowed him to build a form of prosperity far more resilient than that of those who relied entirely on a single activity or resource. Here we find an extraordinarily modern lesson. Many people work hard to increase their income, but very few spend time building mechanisms that continue creating value even when they are not actively working. Solomon understood that true multiplication occurs when the effort invested today continues producing results tomorrow. That is why he invested in lasting structures. That is why he strengthened strategic relationships. That is why he developed projects capable of generating benefits for long periods of time. The logic was simple. If everything depends entirely on your constant presence, your growth will always be limited. But When you build something that continues creating value beyond your immediate involvement, you begin operating under a completely different dynamic. That does not happen overnight, nor does it happen by accident. It requires vision, it requires planning, it requires patience, and above all, it requires discipline. Because multiplication is rarely spectacular in the beginning. It usually starts quietly. Small decisions, small improvements, small constructions, small advances that appear insignificant when viewed individually. Yet over time, they produce extraordinary results. Solomon knew this. That is why he never focused his teachings solely on earning more. He focused them on building better. However, there is a danger that threatens even those who successfully multiply resources and achieve prosperity. A danger that has destroyed countless people long after they reached success. Because acquiring wealth is one thing, learning not to be controlled by it is an entirely different lesson. After reaching a level of wealth that most people could never imagine, Solomon discovered something unexpected. Money has limits, and those limits appear much sooner than most people think. For years, he watched people connect happiness to the next acquisition, the next business venture, the next property, the next opportunity. There was always something else to achieve before they could finally feel satisfied. But the more he observed this behavior, the more a troubling pattern emerged. The promised satisfaction never arrived, because the problem was not the amount of money. The problem was desire. That is why Solomon wrote one of the most honest financial observations in the entire Bible. Whoever loves money will never be satisfied with money. He did not say that money was evil. He did not say that wealth was the problem. What he pointed to was something much deeper. When money stops being a tool and becomes an obsession, no amount will ever be enough. The target constantly moves. When someone reaches one financial goal, another immediately appears. When they acquire one property, they want a better one. When they achieve stability, they begin chasing status. And so they enter a race with no finish line. Solomon understood this reality better than anyone. He's had experienced virtually everything that power and wealth could offer. Yet, he discovered that material abundance could not fill certain inner voids. That realization is uncomfortable because it contradicts one of the most popular beliefs of our time. The belief that more is always better. Solomon saw that many people were not poor because they lacked resources. They were poor because they had never learned how to be content. And a person incapable of experiencing contentment can still feel deprived while surrounded by abundance. That is why greed is so dangerous. Not because it makes people want to improve their lives, but because it convinces them that they never have enough. Greed turns every achievement into something temporary. It transforms every victory into the starting point of a new dissatisfaction. And slowly, it steals the ability to enjoy what one already possesses. Solomon understood that true wealth includes something that cannot be purchased. Peace. The confidence that money occupies the proper place in life. Neither above everything else, nor treated as an enemy, simply as a useful tool serving a greater purpose. Because when a person spends their entire life chasing more money, they often sacrifice the very things that gave meaning to the pursuit in the first place. And it was this understanding that led Solomon to look beyond the accumulation of wealth. He began asking a different question. What remains when gold changes hands, when properties change owners, and when one generation gives way to the next? That question led him to an even deeper reflection. The difference between possessing wealth and leaving a legacy. As Solomon grew older, he began to view money from a different perspective. When he was young, he saw opportunities. When he gained power, he saw expansion. But as the years passed, he began asking a question that very few people consider while they are busy accumulating wealth. What will happen to all of this when I am no longer here? It is a simple question, yet it completely changes the way a person thinks about money. Because there is a profound difference between building wealth for yourself, and building something survives beyond a single generation. Solomon understood that the true value of an estate is not measured solely by what it produces today, but by what it can contribute tomorrow. That is why he spoke about the importance of leaving an inheritance to children's and grandchildren. However, when we examine his teachings carefully, we discover something even more important. The inheritance was not merely money, it was wisdom. There is little value in leaving a great fortune to someone who does not know how to manage it. Money can be transferred in an instant. The ability to manage it takes years to develop. Solomon had observed entire families prosper for one generation only to disappear financially in the next. Not because they lacked resources, but because they lacked understanding. That is why he placed such importance on instruction, prudence, and the development of character. Because wealth without wisdom is temporary. Wisdom, on the other hand, can create wealth again and again. That is the true legacy. Not merely the assets accumulated, but the principles that make it possible to create, protect, and multiply those assets. When a person passes on only money, they leave resources. When they pass on wisdom, they leave capacity. And capacity will always be more valuable than resources. Solomon understood that the strongest form of wealth was not the one stored away in treasuries or warehouses. It was the wealth that remained alive in the decisions of future generations. This realization led him to an even deeper conclusion. Because, after building wealth, governing a kingdom, and observing human behavior for decades, he discovered something he considered more valuable than any treasure he had ever possessed. A truth that completely transformed his understanding of success, prosperity, and the very purpose of life itself. After a lifetime surrounded by wealth, influence, power, and recognition, Solomon arrived at a conclusion that few would expect to hear from the most prosperous man of his time. Wealth is a tool, not a purpose. For years, he watched people devote all their energy to pursuing things that, sooner or later, they would leave behind. He saw many sacrifice their peace in order to gain money, only to spend that money later, trying to recover the peace they had lost. And he came to understand something that became the very heart of his financial wisdom. True success is not measured by how much you possess. It is measured by how much control you have over what you possess. Because one person can have very little and still live in freedom, while another can have immense wealth and yet live enslaved by worry, fear, or endless ambition. That is why Solomon placed wisdom above gold, understanding above silver, and discernment above any material treasure. Not because he despised prosperity, but because he understood that wealth without wisdom can disappear in an instant, while wisdom can rebuild what has been lost. That is the great lesson left behind by the richest man in the Bible. Do not pursue money as though it were your destiny. Pursue wisdom, because when wisdom guides your decisions, money becomes a useful servant. But when money becomes your master, no amount will ever be enough. And that difference can transform not only your finances, but your entire life.